Well, happy birthday, Kalvin Phillips, 26 years old today. Going to have a chat about Kalvin now on the Phil Hay Show, YouTube and podcast version. Dan, Michael, and of course, Phil Hay here to talk about our midfielder. Kalvin then, 26 now, entering the peak of his career. Good player, isn't he?
Does that make you feel old, him being 26? I was thinking about this because quite often I look at the age of players, like these days, Johnny Howson and so on. You think Howson's ticking on now. And you can remember him coming through and you think it really is that long ago since I was that sort of age. But Phillips at 26, he feels like he's been around for ages. But yeah, 26, that make you feel old?
A little bit, yeah. We've ticked past that point now where I've seen players like start their careers and finish their careers. Thinking players like Harry Kewell, and now you're looking at other ones who are just about to finish. James Milner, who's probably going to finish at some point in the next 2 or 3. I mean, like he's still a teenager in my mind. But then again, so am I.
I think Archie Gray's the one for me. When I saw him in the Arsenal squad the other day, I thought I genuinely could be his dad. Like without it, wouldn't have even been a controversial pregnancy. That I'd have been a perfectly acceptable age.
Well, the day Paddy Kenny left Leeds, I think, was the last time that I had a player at Leeds who was older than me. And I suppose the next step for that will be the first time you have a player in the squad who is younger than one of your kids. That it's reached that point, really, hasn't it?
I'll tell you what. This has got into old men shouting at cloud here.
Yes.
So let's talk about Kalvin Phillips. It's also David Batty's birthday as well. Again, he can't be 53. That doesn't feel right to me. But anyway,
he was always 53 in a way. That was David Batty. I think he always had a middle-aged sort of personality about him, didn't he?
Kalvin Phillips has been the breakout star for England this year. I mean, what a 12 months he's had. It's been phenomenal for him, hasn't it? It's just been great. He's England's Player of the Year, mainstay in that midfield. England looks so much better when he's in there. Southgate was there on Tuesday when Leeds played Palace, and no doubt another tick in the box.
Yeah, it seems to me that for all that, opinion is very, very much divided on Southgate, and there seem to be a lot of people who don't think he's actually doing great things with the England squad, or perhaps to be fairer, is not making the sum of the parts collectively as high as it should be given the players that he's got. I think his new contract with the FA is... There's probably nobody who'll be more pleased with that news than Phillips, because he is very much one of the boys under Southgate and right in the mix, and really has been since the start. I always got the impression that Southgate had kind of set this rule that players in the Championship weren't really going to get into his squad. It was more, there were a couple of exceptions, like when Mason Mount was at Derby, but it was going to be Premier League players predominantly who were in there. And I always felt that he was kind of swaying with Phillips because Phillips was playing so well for Bielsa that he wanted to bring him into the fold, but he was just waiting for the right time. But Phillips has done what Rafinha looks like doing with Brazil, which is walked into the squad straight away, start games, and become a fixture overnight. It's not an easy thing to do that, and you've seen that with Bamford. The one game against Andorra and the one call-up, and has had injuries since. But I think for him, it'll be far more difficult to force his way into that position. Whereas with Phillips, you've got Southgate there watching him on Tuesday, and perhaps not just him, but certainly there with Phillips in front of him. And you just know that if he's fit and still in reasonable form, that when Qatar comes round, he is 100% going to be one of the 23 that goes. And that's been one of two stages in his development. The first club-wise under Bielsa, which has been monumental. But again, as an international player, you can tell that the England players playing with him are perfectly happy to have him in the team.
And one of the nice things that came out of the game on Tuesday against Palace was putting to bed this idea of any sort of rift with Bielsa, which is a media narrative that had sprung up because, well, why? Let's examine the reasons why. But he said he'll play goalkeeper if he asks him, and he's got so much respect for Bielsa because he's taken him from being a middling Championship midfielder to the first name on the England team sheet.
Perhaps the one thing we need before Bielsa leaves is an outfield player in goal. Just for the banter. If he's going in the summer, if he decides he's going in the summer and we've got one game left at the end of the season against Brentford or something like that, Phillips goes in goal.
He wouldn't disrespect the opponents.
No, he wouldn't. He'd still try and win 5-0, but just for fun. There's a weird, I think, modern trend which has been developing more and more and more of pundit says X, pundit's comments are put to manager has a pop at pundit, everybody writes about it, and I'm sure I've done that from time to time too. And you do find that sometimes this narrative, like Bielsa and Phillips are banging heads, is created from a pretty innocuous throwaway discussion in a Sky studio after or during the Brighton game on Saturday, where I think it's fair to say there was frustration and there was confusion, and there was no doubt about that. It was not a good performance, and I think you could see in Phillips' body language that he was thinking, at centre back, I'm now back in midfield. It's not quite working. But a lot of ways to go at this. The first is to say that him being substituted early is by no means a new phenomenon with Bielsa. And actually, as Bielsa's proved pretty comprehensively, you don't get any sacred cows at Leeds. There is literally nobody that Bielsa is scared of upsetting by saying you're coming off after 20 minutes or at half time. I'm not saying he necessarily feels good about doing it. And he has apologised a few times after the games where it's occurred for him having to do it. But you had Phillips substituted, in the first half of his 100th club appearance at Swansea. You had him substituted at half-time at Old Trafford. The last season, the game that Phillips has spent all week saying to the players, you need to know how big this is. His first chance to play for Leeds against Man United. And, it's an absolute washout for him. So on that basis alone, Phillips coming off, I don't think had any significance to it. The other thing is that we know what a fallout with Bielsa looks like. It looks like Janssen getting sold to Brentford, with no other offers on the table, but the club told, I want you to sell him, and basically you're going to have to take that offer because that's what is there. And Janssen's gone. Hernandez, the black armband incident, and he did kind of come back into the fold. It was slightly different with Hernandez because he did seem to be fading out of the picture somewhat anyway. But was then basically on the bench in league games for the next 4 or 5 months before the final appearance against West Brom. That's what happens when you fall out with Bielsa. What doesn't happen is that you go back into the starting lineup on Tuesday and you smash Conor Gallagher after 6 minutes and you play like Phillips played. And it seemed quite obvious to me, looking at what was going on, that it was the talk of a clash between them just wasn't there, really. It was making something of something that didn't really seem to exist. And I don't think, as I say, we should pretend that this season will have been good for people and that everybody in the background at Leeds will be sitting saying, "Oh, isn't this fun?" Because it's not fun when you're playing poorly and when you're struggling for results. But it did just seem like a kind of monumental leap, and something that actually, when we asked Bielsa about it on Monday, he seemed totally nonplussed about.
And the Premier League is a TV program. Let's not forget, it makes all its money through being a TV program, predominantly overseas, and in this country as well. And it needs to have narrative attached to it, doesn't it? It needs to have storylines. I mean, a friend of mine who lives in the Middle East says that's how it's almost billed. Like on Middle Eastern TV, it'll be around manager clashes with manager, this player clashes with this player. It's not the same as we consume it as fans, and we're so emotionally attached to the idea of our manager, Bielsa. He's a sacred cow, so is Phillips. And the idea of the two of them falling out is just, it's horrible, isn't it?
I think that's the way. It's why England's Kalvin Phillips falling out with Bielsa is, that's the storyline. If Pascal Struijk is getting moved around the pitch and doing a post-match interview, no one cares, because outside of Leeds fans, he's not someone that people fully know about yet, and it doesn't generate any discussion. Jamie Redknapp probably doesn't know who he is. He doesn't really seem to know where Kalvin Phillips plays a lot of the time either, to be perfectly honest.
Whereas Michael Owen would have watched him come up through the the Leeds junior teams.
Saw
him play when he was 15 and 10 and all the rest of it. Sorry, go on. I derailed you.
That's fine. But I think it's just the frustration of knowing that is why it's being talked about. It's not that there's anything necessarily there. It's just, well, people know Kalvin Phillips, and it's something people will be interested in.
From seeing what happened with Hernandez and Janssen, you know that it could happen. It's not out of beyond the realms of possibility that could happen. But I think if you're going to say that, you have to be pretty sure that is the case. It's a bit brash to kind of float that without any substance to it. I thought as well there was a big contrast between the Crystal Palace game where Hernandez was left out after him throwing the black armband away, and us pressing Bielsa on that, and Bielsa basically saying, I've said what I said, I do not want to say any more on this, and giving you the impression that yes, there is an issue, and yes, there is a problem, but I'm not going to do this in public, and I've said what I've said, and that's the end of it. Whereas with Phillips, when he was asked, about you might have fallen out with him, his first reply was to say, you're going to need to explain that a bit more to me, because I don't know what you mean. And actually, but somebody on Twitter swears blind to me, and they did have a photo of Bielsa and Costa, and they said to me that yesterday, I think, and this is Wednesday of this week, Bielsa was in Costa reading articles about him and Kalvin Phillips, And at the end of every one, he ripped them in half and put them in the bin. So he seemed kind of surprised by it, to be asked that, and did really just say there's no problem with anybody, And also, if you're telling me that Phillips can never be subbed, then I'm telling you you're absolutely wrong. And on that point, he's right. And Phillips knows the drill. I mean, Phillips has seen that before, and to get a performance like that on commitment like that, I didn't think Phillips actually played especially well on Tuesday. I thought Forshaw had by far the better game of the two, but you only had to look at it even prior to Phillips' post-match comments, where he kind of said, I'll play in goal if I have to. You looked at it and you thought, there's nothing going on here.
And it was Joe Catling who tweeted you that, because I've just gone in and found it, the retweet that you did. And we do know, don't we, that Bielsa has all the articles that are written about him translated, and he reads everything. A
huge number of them, yes.
So you have to behave yourself, Phil Hay, because if he suddenly walks out one day, I'll be going through your articles to make sure you've been nice about Marcelo Bielsa. Just going back to Jamie Redknapp, I do wonder if Jamie Redknapp has thought, I wouldn't like it if that was happening to me, if I was being told to go back into central defence, and therefore Kalvin Phillips doesn't like it either.
Perhaps. The one thing that did obviously pop up was the interview that Phillips did at Spurs, where he did sound like he wasn't quite sure what was going on, and he was saying himself there were times in the second half where we should have gone long. There was that conflict between him saying, I don't know why Bielsa put me where he put me, but then explained why he had, because they'd obviously worked on it through the week. And if I'm being charitable to Phillips, I think maybe what he was meaning was, if you want to understand why I was in the centre of defence, you probably need to ask him. It's his decision and it's his call.
And let's not forget, he was brilliant when he marked Harry Kane.
He did really well
in that first half.
He did. But if you wanted to microanalyze the interview, the pauses in it and some of the comments in it, it was all just a bit weird.
Yeah, we've got the Sky Sports linguistic expert in to tell us what this means.
It wasn't that sort of really, really sort of full of conviction, confidence that you quite often get from Phillips. But I don't think many of us dwelt on it particularly, and I don't think many of us looked at it and thought, that's really, really odd. It was kind of weird, but it wasn't that big a deal. And you might be right. It might well be that for somebody like Redknapp, he looks at that and thinks, if I was getting as a midfielder, I was getting played at centre-back, I wouldn't be happy. The point is that Phillips is a totally different midfielder to Redknapp, not even remotely comparable in the way that they play it, the way that what they do, and also the way that they've been trained. Phillips has been trained to be an auxiliary centre-back, and to drop in between the two central defenders when he has to, when Leeds are in possession. It's not an especially new thing. I just think on Saturday at Brighton, it really didn't work particularly well, and it did look messy. There's no question about that. But that's not the same as saying that the two of them are kicking lumps out of each other at Thorpe Arch.
Well, the other subtext that kind of underpins all this is that he's an England international now. He's too good for Leeds. He'll be leaving. And I think that's what it's feeding into, that whole sort of storyline, isn't it?
It's also the Premier League, which is what I was saying about, pundit says this, manager. You see it a lot with Jurgen Klopp and Gary Neville as one example. Gary Neville said this, and, Klopp can get quite frustrated about some of the things that are said. So we'll give very quotable quotes in return, and it makes a fight over something which sometimes you think is not a waste of everybody's energy. This Klopp, just to veer off on a tangent for a second, this seemed kind of very angry to me this season, despite how well the team are playing. And you might remember him having a pop at a Spanish journalist after the Atletico Madrid game, where Simeone didn't shake his hand at full time. And that, I think, goes back to what you were saying about Premier League narrative, managers falling out, players falling out with managers. Well, Klopp got to the point after the game of saying, he didn't shake my hand, I didn't shake his hand, but you know what, I don't care, and I can't be bothered speaking about this, and I don't want to speak about this, and end of story, really. And I think there was a degree of that over the weekend, of just looking at the Phillips thing. I mean, I spoke to people and said, is there any issue here? Not at all. Not really. Which is not to say that Phillips would have enjoyed the Brighton game or would have felt like the system was working or the performance going well. I think all the players would have come off happy with the point, but pretty disappointed with the way they'd played. But that's not the same as having a kind of bona fide rift with your manager.
In terms of him staying, or maybe going at some point further down the line, I was greatly encouraged when we spoke to Hayden Evans in here the other week about him saying, Kalvin's got really strong feelings and dropped the L-bomb, loyalty to Leeds as a club. So where are we in terms of him staying? And the contract has kind of been mooted. It's kind of been spoken about sort of quietly, hasn't it? Are we any further along with that?
I don't think so. I don't think that's really made any progress, although I wouldn't have said that either side, him or the club, felt an urgent rush to get it done. But there does seem to be commitment on Phillips' side to speak about it, commitment on Leeds' side to renegotiate and to pay him more, and to understand that because he is an England international now, and because he is, one of the pick of the players at Ellen Road, he should be earning more and should be closer to the sort of wage that an England international would earn. But no, I don't think at this stage there's been much in the way of progress with it.
He's on sort of mid-level wages, isn't he, for the squad or thereabouts?
He's on pretty good money, he is. It's not a poor wage, but everything becomes relative. And it's not just that he's kind of around the England squad, he's in it and he's in the team. And he is a high-value player. I mean, I always remember speaking to Robert Snodgrass about this after he left Leeds, and he would say from time to time, Leeds would say to him things like, we think of you as a £8 million player or a £10 million player. If we were ever to sell you, particularly in the periods where Snodgrass was starting to get a bit fed up with how things were going at Leeds and this kind of lack of ambition, they would say that to him. We think that's what you'd be valued at. And he said, part of me was thinking, well, in that case, pay me the wage of a £10 million player. Oh no, we don't want to do that. No, well, you see, that is the middle ground that you have to find, is that you can't spend more than you can afford to spend, but equally, you can't hang on to assets of high value and of high worth if you don't pay them what they're worth. And as I say, you can tell by speaking to Leeds that they totally understand that with Phillips.